A very, very warm welcome to this evening's keynote lecture. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Susan Ashbrook Harvey, it's an honour for me to call upon the Rector of the Hebrew University, Professor Cohen, to greet us.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here. Unfortunately, I will not be able to listen to the keynote lecture, which I'm sure will be extremely interesting. One other time. But let me welcome you to this conference. I'm told that there are 26 nationalities here in this room, and it's really pleasing to know that. We often like to have international conferences around here, which reflects in many ways the activity of the Hebrew University. Since I'm the representative of the Hebrew University, let me tell you just briefly a little bit about the history of our university. Many of you do research on Christianity, Judaism, and go many centuries back. Well, the Hebrew University is not that ancient. It was founded just 88 years ago. But I think that in many ways its foundation is a good symbolization of what the university is trying to be about. I'll tell you about two of the founders of the Hebrew University, and then I'll tell you why I tell you about them. One of them, you all heard his name, Albert Einstein. In 1925, it was just 4 years removed from his Nobel Prize winning, which he did. He won, by the way, on a prize unrelated to his most renowned discovery. That was the man. And he represents, if you will, the pure science, the theoretical science at the university. On the other side, there was another person, Sigmund Freud, another founder. One can argue about his psychoanalytic theory, and I know many people do argue, but one cannot argue about his cultural impact on the 20th century. And between the two of them, Sigmund Freud on the one side and Albert Einstein on the other side, you see the spectrum of where the Hebrew University is trying to be, which is all over the place, as long as we do it well. Because like any other top research university, we strive for excellence. But there is one more thing that I think is represented by those two people that I want to emphasize, and the word is pluralism. If you read Einstein's biography, you will see that Einstein was not just about science. Yes, he might be the most renowned scientist of all time, but he was also a humanist. He always preached for pluralism. He always preached for a worldview that is as wide and as liberal as possible. And the Hebrew University, I think, is trying to follow that particular avenue as well. We try to be as pluralistic as possible. We try to be both excellent and open-minded at the same time. We are situated in Jerusalem, where many religions claim their faith. In some ways, it's probably related to, in some ways, I don't know in how many ways, to the conference here as well. But once again, you can do it one way or another, and we believe in pluralism when we do that as well. We have centers for Judaism, and we have centers for Christianity here. And in fact, this particular conference is associated with the Center for Christianity that we have here since the year 2000, I believe. So, having said all this, I'm happy to welcome you here to the university, to the city. I hope, in addition to enjoying the excellent conference here, you will also enjoy the city and what it has to offer. And I hope that you will come here many more times in the future. And I hope that there will be many more good, interesting conferences such as the one that is organized here in the future as well. So enjoy the conference, and thank you.
Stay so I can say a few words of thanks to you before you go. Thank you. I've asked Professor Cohen to stay behind just for a few moments so that I can express our thanks, really for allowing the International Association of Patristic Studies to hold the conference at the Hebrew University. When we were discussing where in the world we might have the conference, we could think of nowhere more significant for the history of Christianity than Jerusalem, and nowhere more fitting, really, than the Centre for the Study of Christianity at the Hebrew University, with its, and I'm not just saying this, internationally respected and distinguished record of outstanding scholarship in our field. And so we therefore felt extremely privileged that the Centre, and especially Bruriah, Bitter Ashkelon, agreed to cooperate with us in the conference. And now that it's actually taking place, it owes an enormous amount to Bruriah's enthusiastic support and unstinting hard work over the last couple of years. So thank you, Professor Cohen, on behalf of the International Association of Patristic Studies, for allowing us to be here. And thank you to the Centre, to Bruriah, and also to Daniel, for enabling us to collaborate with such an internationally distinguished centre. Thank you.
And thank you again.
I shouldn't sit down, should I? Because now for this evening's lecture. Susan, thank you for your patience. Professor Susan Ashbrook Harvey is currently in what I think may be the unique position of holding two different professorships running concurrently in the same place. Do you know of anybody else that does this? She's both the Willard Prescott and Annie McClellan Smith Professor of Religious Studies and also the Royce Family Professor of Teaching Excellence, both held at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. She's well known to all of us as, and I hesitate here because of Dennis's comments this morning, I was going to say small, but still relatively small, but very select and extremely distinguished group of patristic scholars worldwide who specialize in Syriac studies and the Christianity of the Byzantine and Syriac traditions. Her work in these areas has brought to our attention a world which, for many of us, would otherwise still be unfamiliar and difficult of access, simply because of the linguistic barriers. She's introduced us to figures such as the Eastern ascetic John of Ephesus, to a wide variety of female voices, biblical, ascetic, and saintly, who would otherwise not be heard, to the poetry and hymns of the Syriac tradition, and in her latest book, to the elusive but often seductive scents and smells which inspired the spiritual practices and doctrinal reflections of the early Christians in her book Scenting Salvation, Ancient Christianity and the Olfactory Imagination. I'd like to invite her, rather like a Thura for bearing incense, to deliver her lecture now on Patristic Worlds, because I'm sure that, like the subject of her book, it will inspire our imaginations to experience those worlds, whatever they might be, in a new way. Susan, thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that right? Is that right? Thank you very much, Carol, for that very gracious introduction. Thank you to Bruriah and to Daniel for their endless hard labor for this conference, and to IAPS for giving me this extraordinary opportunity to be here for this conference in this place at this time. Dennis Trout spoke this morning of what a chastening honor it is to face this august gathering, and it feels that way. It feels like a chastening honor. And I have an impossible task. So I have unilaterally set myself some boundaries, I hope one of which is time. We've been very privileged today. When I chose my title, Patristic Worlds, what was on my mind was the multiplicity of worlds in which we all teach and work, the locations out of which we do our work, but also the multiplicity of the worlds we study in antiquity. And I didn't know how to talk about all of that in a paper, and happily, the first part of that, namely our multiplicity and diversity, has been the topic of today's papers thus far, and they've been wonderfully and richly presented to us. So I'm going to take as my task the ancient counterpart to that. Martin Walraff spoke this morning of the fathers and mothers of the people we study, of a world with complex religious interactions and orientation in a multi-religious reality. And Bronwyn Neal put it rather more bluntly when she spoke of religion taking place in a context of crisis management and religious conflict. I am taking as my task to set before us two ancient scenarios that represent these themes. And Dennis Trout spoke also about the fact that our work is often characterized by our particular and even idiosyncratic interests. So this is the most particular and idiosyncratic I can imagine being, to take just some of my current favorite passages. I'm going to talk about two scenarios. The first one is that of religious pluralism as a given context when we study ancient Christianity, and we will be helped in that by the 5th century Christian historian Sozomen, and my location as a religious studies scholar. And the second will be voices. One of the things I think that has characterized the study of patristics in the last 50 years, or what did we say, 46 years, most dramatically has been our concern as scholars with voices from what we sometimes speak of as voices from the margins, right? So for me, I will represent that with voices from Syriac, women's voices, and ordinary lay people. So with that, I would like to begin with Sozomen, but first by telling a story. In the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 to 15, we are told of the famed encounter between the patriarch Abraham and his Lord, who appeared to him at the oaks of Mamre in the form of 3 unnamed men. This is a very familiar story. We know Abraham offered his visitors generous hospitality, and in his tent, his wife Sarah prepared cakes for the visitors and also laughed because the visitors announced that in a year's time, the elderly couple would have a son. The sanctity of the encounter, the memory of the place, and the prophetic quality of the visitors' announcement have rendered Mamre a holy site, venerated for millennia and even to the present day. I believe the Russian Orthodox have presided over the site since 1868, but it's still a place of pilgrimage. In early Christian times, the veneration of Mamre took the form of an annual festival commemorating the event of Abraham and his visitors. The church historian Sozomen wrote about this festival and its renowned fair in the 5th century. He wrote about 100 years after the events he describes. Sozomen tells us that this festival attracted a huge crowd of pilgrims every year from various religions. Jews came because they claimed their descent from Abraham. Pagans, or Sozomen calls them Greeks, Hellenes, came because they understood the 3 visitors to be heavenly beings, a divine appearance like those from their own sacred stories. And Christians came because they understood the divine visitors in Trinitarian terms, or to have been the divine Son, Christ, appearing with 2 angels. Sozeman describes the events like this. This brilliant feast, he uses the adjective lampron, brilliant. This brilliant feast is diligently frequented by all peoples. And this place, Mamre, is moreover honored fittingly, prosporos, with religious exercises. Here, some people prayed to the God of all, some call upon the angels, some poured out wine or burnt incense or offered an ox or a he-goat or a sheep or a cock. Sozeman's account culminated with the intervention of the Emperor Constantine in an episode recorded also in the life of Constantine, who ordered the removal and destruction of all of the non-Christian structures and religious objects of the site, and instead construction of a church, henceforth to be the only site of religious activity at Mamre, now, after Constantine, to be known exclusively as a Christian holy place. Sozeman's account is interesting for a number of reasons, not least because of its picture of religion in the ancient Mediterranean. In the course of his passage, Sozeman refers to a sacred story and a sacred place, to pilgrimage, prayers, altars, votive offerings, processions, sacrifices, incense, candles, lamps, wine, special food, special attire, and cultic objects. And buildings, right? A temple, a church. These were media by which devotees encountered and experienced in concrete and bodily terms their relationship with the divine, whichever divine that might be. As Sozeman notes, these were devotional practices shared across an array of Mediterranean religions. How then might the ancient worshiper differentiate the shared from the specific? Sozeman's account, as we might expect, does more than describe. He includes a strong element of religious critique, describing but also assessing the activities that he highlights. He does this by noting sensory qualities. Thus, he stresses, in his description of all the activities taking place, he stresses characteristics appropriate to religious ritual in general, and perhaps especially in terms of the event being commemorated, in this instance, an encounter of divine generosity and human hospitality. So he tells us the festival was radiant, lampran, brilliant, and commemorating a divine appearance, which itself is a form of radiance. The celebration was lit by lamps, by candles and sacrificial fires, and the excitement of the accompanying fare. There was beauty. The votive offerings that people brought, he tells us, were beautiful, made with fine craftsmanship and often taking the entire year in between the festival to make. The women, he tells us, were, quote, more than ordinarily studious with their beauty and their adornment. But, he says, the public processions were decorous and no one behaved imprudently, despite he is surprised that no one behaved imprudently, because everyone slept outside together, so a suspension of normal social conditions. Self-discipline, then, was part of the events and a fitting expression of reverence. Offerings were manifold and freely, even lavishly given. By such details, Sozeman tells us much about what was valued in the practices of ancient religion, broadly speaking. Beauty, brilliance, decorum, variety, and generosity. But Sozeman's rhetoric of religious critique also makes clear the context of religious competition. For although it seems that people attending the festival had no trouble finding the truths of their own religious traditions made evident by the story of Abraham and his visitors, yet to Sozeman and to Constantine, shared ritual piety did not mean shared religious truth. In order to differentiate true religion, Christianity, from its competitors, at the festival, Sozeman adds moral or ethical qualities to the sensory experiences involved, so that his rhetorical description carried moral and ethical ramifications. Accordingly, although he speaks of the religious activities at Mamre as fitting prosphoros, Sozomen also suggests otherwise. By noting the abundance and variety of sacrifices, he suggests excess. There's a long list of the animals and the birds and the different kinds of made offerings that people offer. Well, variety is, there's too much. His concern about sleeping in open tents raises the question of impropriety even as he denies it. He comments that the well water, there's a well next to the trees, is undrinkable during the festival because of the offerings that are thrown into it. He mentions people threw into the well wine, cakes, coins, myrrh, and incense, so that it was undrinkable. Hints at a concern for impurity that borders on disgust, and disgust is always a morally coded emotion. He mentions that Constantine's mother-in-law, when she came to the site, was dismayed by the festive array and particularly shocked by the established custom of pleasantness, idios, the happiness of the occasion, and thus he implies that the festival harbored a general tone of irreverence, excess, impropriety, impurity, and irreverence. These are the vices opposed to the virtues we were just noting for the very same ritual practices. All these vices and virtues are implied rather than stated concretely in Sozomen's account. He never actually says anything bad about non-Christian religions. But the reader cannot miss his view. The vices and virtues, Sozomen notes, were realized by sensory encounters. Sensory experience was intrinsic to religious activity, as it is to any activity. It also provides crucial information for the participants. For sensory experience could not be left unparsed any more than Scripture could remain unexamined. In Sozomen's account, we can see how rhetorical description could be used to demarcate what was fitting for worship of the divine and what was not, in terms that engage sensory filters. His account provides a mini tutorial in training the senses to right perception. Practices might appear to be the same. Careful attention showed otherwise. We could make a definition of religion in the ancient world from Sozomen's account of the events at the Oaks of Mamre. Religious studies departments like to make definitions of religion. It's what we do all the time. Ancient religions were fundamentally relational systems, first between the human and divine realms, and then within human social order. Religion comprised the practices and structures by which people establish and maintain human-divine relation, and by which they accordingly define themselves within a social and political order founded on that human-divine relation. A shared treasure chest of ritual tools provided the practices that enabled such relationality, enacting it across domestic, social, and political landscapes. These practices engage a rich sensorium, whether in the simplest individual act, lighting a candle, making the sign of a cross, or in the grandest public spectacle, which the Oaks at Mamre clearly involved. Underlying this perspective was a cosmology in which human and divine domains intersected. However separate, these domains were constantly permeable. Religious practices molded sensory awareness and continuously engaged it, promoting a basic religious epistemology. The divine could be perceived and thereby experienced. Sensory experience could be revelatory. Indeed, where sight was often the most valued sense from the view of philosophy, yet religious practices engaged the other senses in even more significant terms, since these made every encounter tangible and every practice greater than its appearance. One could sense more than one could see or do. Hence, the senses provided vividly real and concrete knowledge of the divine. The senses enabled the body to experience human-divine relation, to express that relation, and to know and negotiate its contours. While pagan and Christian authors had long attended to such perspectives, Christian writers began to show marked and sustained interest in the sensory aspects of religion during the 4th century, as they gained legal status, imperial favor, and by the century's end, the status of state religion in the Roman Empire. In catechetical homilies, sermons, hymns, and other forms of public teaching, Christians gave attention to the work of the senses as something significant for religious practice and meaning. In homilies and hymns, Christian leaders noted how sense perception affected one's body, and more importantly, its resulting impact on one's religious understanding. Just so did the 4th century hymn writer, Ephraim the Syrian, sing together with his congregation the wonders of bodily experience. I quote, "Let us see those things God does for us every day. How many tastes for the mouth, how many beauties for the eye, how many melodies for the ear, how many scents for the nostrils. Who is sufficient in comparison to the goodness of these little things?" Most often, Christian authors show an interest in the epistemological results of such a view. How the sensory encounter yielded greater knowledge of God, or what kind of knowledge was gained, or how such knowledge should be used in daily life. Though beyond the confines of my remarks today, or indeed our time, we should also consider the rise of Christian monasticism, or severe asceticism, mystical and visionary literature in this broader context of sensory experience. These were practices that sought to change the body and render it anew, able to perceive and experience the divine in ever more profound degrees. But let us turn to our second scenario, that of diversity and practice. In late antiquity, as noted, religious practice invariably took place in the context of religious critique and competition. As Sozeman has shown for the festival at Mamre, pluralism could be confusing. In fact, it seems to me Sozeman makes a theme out of how confusing religious pluralism really was in the ancient world. How could one distinguish between truth and falsity if the practices seem to be the same? Furthermore, how could one distinguish between beauty that was fittingly offered to God and sensory indulgence? Such distinctions were crucial for right relation with God as with one another, and crucial for knowing truth. The senses were necessary to adjudicate the right practice and true knowledge. Let us take the example of hymns, the one dimension Sozeman does not include in his account of Mamre, but which were unquestionably part of the soundscape. Hymns were sung, they were heard and overheard. They were performed, received, and joined into. You sang along. Their content offered instruction, while their presentation enabled participation. They worked simultaneously in various registers. And here, with my limitations, I turn specifically to Christianity, and specifically to Syriac Christianity. In the turbulent context of ancient religion, the context Sozeman delineated so clearly, the work of hymns as a religious practice took on particular importance. Commentaries or theological treatises belonged to the scholarly elite, usually men. But hymns could be, and were, written for public performance and participation. Their purpose was to instruct, exhort, and inspire the faithful, learned or unlearned, young or old, male or female. At a time when few people owned a Bible, hymns were crucial tools for teaching Bible and church doctrines, for the moral formation of Christian subjects, and the ethical training of Christian citizens. At the same time, hymns were a vehicle to declare truth. Exceeding the confines of formal liturgy, they could be sung anytime, anywhere, by anyone. Written in different patterns of verse, punctuated usually by a simple refrain, hymns could be performed in various ways. They elicited dialogic exchange between chanters, choirs, male and female choirs, congregations, and clergy. They were a basic form of lay participation in liturgical celebration. By their function as participatory and performative tools, hymns were a primary weapon of religious competition in the civic domain, a means for the public display of religion, and right truth. Chronicles and hagiographies note that liturgical processions singing through city streets of mixed religious populations, or proceeding from villages or towns out to holy places. Liturgies proceeded out to the stylites' pillars or out to the martyrs' relics. They mention liturgies performed outdoors in public spaces, such as city squares or at monasteries that were themselves often visited by non-Christians in search of healings or other assistance. A great deal of ancient worship was public fare, visible, audible, and tangibly available to all of any religious persuasion. And we should remember this when we worry about or talk about influence between religions. How much was shared simply through overhearing in the open spaces of the ancient city. Competitive and polemical tones were invariably sounded forth and heard as rival groups attempted to out-sing each other, and there's no question. Think of John Chrysostom describing the Nicene Christians trying to out-sing the Arians, or Augustine with the Donatists out-singing his meagerly somber, as he describes them, congregation. The sound of hymns, just the sound of hymns, included far more than their literary content or even their manner of presentation. What was sung, how it was sung, when, where, by whom, and for whom were matters demonstrating paradigms of gender, hierarchy, authority, inclusion, and exclusion, all in the context of religious ritual performance that reference the civic domain, even when performed elsewhere. Take the example of Ephraim the Syrian, composing his hymns during the 4th century for women's choirs to sing in civic churches with congregational participation. In content, Ephraim's hymns are strikingly biblical. They retell biblical stories and summarize vast arcs of scriptural narrative, offering a dazzling multiplicity of interpretive models from the simple to the startlingly complex. And we should not take for granted this emphasis on Bible. Ephraim wrote his hymns for the cities of Nisibis and Edessa, where there was tremendous competition as to who owned Bible. Was the Hebrew Bible owned by Jews? Was it owned by Christians? He's in Edessa very concerned about the people called Christians are Marcionites, who have a different canon altogether. When Ephraim's hymns summarize an entire arc of the Bible, all of its books, Old and New Testament, as he knew them, this isn't innocent. This is competition and rivalry over who gets this stuff, and you need to know what the stuff is. Favoring a robust understanding of symbol and type, Ephraim invariably links biblical figures and events with liturgical settings and practice. Further, he intersects Bible and liturgy with the civic context in which Christians lived, with typologies that include moral and ethical paradigms. In vivid poetry, sung to multiple melodies, Ephraim interwound imagined voices of the biblical past with the real voices of the present, those of liturgically constructed Christian subjects. The singing engaged the entire liturgical assembly, chanter with choirs, in sung dialogue with clergy, enriched by congregational responses and refrains. Never forget the importance of refrains. That's how the people are participating. Ephraim's typological patterning invited a continual dance between Bible liturgy and daily life. Always, from every and any level of analysis, Ephraim invites his fellow singers, whether cleric or lay, to greater knowledge of God. By way of example, Ephraim's hymns on virginity are a large and loosely gathered collection of hymns on various themes. They weren't written as a collection. Some of these hymns speak to those taking up the life of consecrated virginity, and others speak to a broader and more inclusive congregation of the whole civic community. In these hymns, Ephraim noticeably addresses a number of New Testament women directly, personally, with joyous acclamation. For example, to Martha, he sings, "Blessed are you, Martha, to whom love gave the confidence to open your mouth. Blessed is your mouth that sounded forth with love." And the verb he uses for giving confidence also is a verb meaning to be indignant. You remember, Martha opened her mouth to complain in Luke 10. There's no question. She opened to complain. Blessed are you, Martha, for opening your mouth to complain. To the woman who called a blessing to Christ from the crowd in Luke 11:27, he offers thanks for, quote, "to you for your voice that became a trumpet among the silent." To the Canaanite woman who dared to approach Jesus despite her heathen status and who refused his rebuke at her insistence that he, remember, Jesus rebukes her. Ephraim sings to her praise for her boldness. He calls it chutzpah. This is the word in Syriac, right? Chutzpah. Quote, "Blessed are you who conquered Christ, the unconquerable one. Blessed are you who broke through the obstacle fearlessly." But Ephraim grants special regard to the Samaritan woman who met Jesus at the well in John chapter 4, and realizing his true identity, returned to her city to proclaim that the Messiah had come. Ephraim praises her as the enlightener of her people and emphasizes the quality of her voice. In her encounter with Jesus at the well, Ephraim sings, "She spoke up with perception, as a learned one, as a disputant, yet modestly." These are all quotations from lines. Her voice was authoritative, he sings, as she engaged in conversation with Jesus, who led her step by step to understand him first as a Jew, then as a prophet, then as Messiah, and finally as God. In Hymns on Virginity 23, Ephraim sings that the Samaritan woman's public preaching of Christ to her people was a wonder as great as the virgin birth itself. He addresses her directly, "O woman of Samaria." Mary, from within her womb in Bethlehem, brought forth Christ's body as a child. But you, woman of Samaria, you by your mouth made him manifest as an adult in Shechem, the town of his father's household. Blessed are you, O woman, who brought forth by your mouth light for those in darkness. While the congregation chanted the refrain, "Glory to the discoverer of all," Ephraim continued to contrast Mary's physical conception with the Samaritan woman's spiritual one. Both received God's revelation by word, and both brought that word forth. I quote, "Mary, the thirsty land in Nazareth, conceived our Lord by her ear. You too, O woman, thirsting for water, conceived the Son by your hearing. Blessed are your ears that drank from the source and gave drink to the world. Mary planted him in a manger, but you planted him in the ears of your listeners." In this hymn, as so often, Ephraim moves back and forth between third-person description and second-person direct address, blurring the line between the Samaritan woman of New Testament times and the liturgy in which he sings. Praising her glory, he joins biblical past to the present moment. I quote, "Your love was zealous to share your treasure with your city." But whom is he addressing? Rendering the Samaritan woman musically present, he holds her as a living exemplar for the choir and the congregation both, who are also, in fact, zealously singing with love to share their treasure with their city. You know, I came a few days early, and one of the places that my husband, we've been visiting, it was Capernaum, and there you see it. If you haven't been, you go. The synagogue is here, where I'm standing, and the church is where the first row is. I mean, this is how close they are the synagogue and the church. Right there. So when Ephraim sings, "Blessed are you, O bold of speech," he's singing it so that those people right there have no mistake in what they're hearing. Nor did Ephraim think that people should sing without realizing the sensory import of their act. Birds or other creatures also sang, as Ephraim pointed out in his hymns on the Nativity, but without comprehension of their act or its content. God is the one, I'm quoting here, who himself constructed the senses of our minds so that we might sing on our lyre, something that the mouth of the bird is unable to sing with its melodies. Indeed, Ephraim sings, all of creation should join together in hymns of thanksgiving. I quote, "Let us glorify with all our mouths the Lord of all means of salvation." It is a frequent theme of his. As for the festival of the Nativity, I quote again, "Unveil, make joyful your face, O creation, on our feast. Sing, O church, with a voice. Heaven and earth sing in silence, sing and confess the child who has brought freedom for all." The bold and loud voices of biblical figures hence provide the model for the voices of the women's choirs that sang forth Ephraim's hymns, and for the congregation who joined their voices in the refrain. Their joyful shouts, joyful shouts, should reach the ears of unbelievers with powerful effect, Ephraim sings. On Easter morning, he exalts, and this is from also from the hymns on this is from the Paschal hymns. This joyful festival, Easter, is entirely made up of tongues and voices, innocent young women and men sounding like trumpets and horns, while infant girls and boys resemble harps and lyres. Their voices intertwine as they reach up towards heaven, giving glory to the Lord of glory. And the refrain for all the people to sing, "Blessed is he for whom the silent have thundered out." Other Syriac sources praise the loud voices of women's choirs. There are two adjectives used for the women's choirs wherever they are cited in Syriac, loud and sweet. Loud. There are no, to this day, when you hear Syriac choirs singing with Syriac women's choirs, there is one dynamic. None of this Western, modulation of, one, loud, okay. So, Syriac sources exhort the congregation also to sound forth their parts in like manner. Here are the verbs: shout, call out, thunder forth. Such are the summons given to the congregation, whether for responsive, collective prayers, or hymns in diverse Syriac liturgical texts. We have one East Syriac commentary from the 5th century that says, "When you say the Lord's Prayer, the walls of the church should shake," right? The liturgy itself, in Syriac as in Greek or Latin, recalled the seraphim singing likewise in Isaiah 6:3. Remember the seraphim shouting, proclaiming, and saying, "Holy, holy, holy." For the bishop and preacher Jacob of Sarug, late in the 5th century and early in the 6th century, the accumulating force of ritual sound affected participants and hearers both, impacting the worshiper, but also Satan. Jacob said, "Satan is annoyed by these holy hymns that we sing." It was this boldness of voice that effectively dispensed with all competitors as ritual sound took place in civic contexts. In poetic homilies sung to his congregations, Jacob himself sang forth. This is Jacob of Sarug, I quote, "The sound of your praise, O Lord, thunders awesomely among the congregations, and through it the impudent song of idolatry was silenced. From your hymns, your sermons, and your teachings, the entire inhabited world shouted out and thundered to sing praise." Such texts tell us something, I think, about religious practice. It was loud. Ephraim and Jacob taught their congregations in song. Jacob's homilies were sung. They were poems that were sung just as Ephraim's hymns were sung by the choir. In addition to words of teaching, their verses stress the sensory qualities of voice, important not only as something heard, but also as something sounded forth. Here, the sensory experience of voice brings us to the intersection of practice with knowledge, a turn engaged and yielded through embodied participation. So now we'll go to the sensory side of this. Jacob of Sarug's homilies in Syriac, they're called mimre. They were composed as poetry and they were delivered as chanted song to a simple meter, offered occasional exhortations about and reflections on the sound of liturgy, both what one heard sounding forth from others, from clergy, from choirs, from congregations, and what one voiced oneself in sound, in prayer, in recitation, and in song. Jacob contrasted the commotion of civic life with what he called the sweet sounds of liturgy, each with consequence for one's moral disposition. For this reason, Jacob admonished, the sounds or singing or performances of the city outside the liturgy pose great danger. He mentions the lamenting voice of wailing women as funeral processions would work their way through the streets. He mentions the singing and playing of actors in the theater. He mentions bad news and good reports, gossip. Everything that one hears penetrates the soul's disposition, he said, and cause it to respond in kind, with weeping, laughter, fear, or happy mood. One is pulled in every direction, fragmented. Here then is the importance of listening in liturgy. I quote from Jacob, "Now when the soul hears the voice of the service, of the liturgy, when the soul hears the voice of the liturgy, in God's house, she is spiritually moved with the love of God." There's a line in one of Ephraim's hymns that's clearly where he prays that God should help us forget the news we've heard today. And he's not talking about something calamitous. He's talking about gossip. Oh Lord, help us forget what we heard today to hear now, what we hear now in liturgy. Listening in liturgy, according to Jacob of Sarug, united the self that the sounds of the world outside literally pulled to pieces. In Jacob's view, listening required open awareness to the various dimensions of liturgical sound. Not only should one listen to the words, but also, he says, to the tunes and the melodies, none of which survive to us, alas. The music itself, he says, worked upon the soul, penetrating beyond cognitive recognition to the inner quality of disposition. He stresses here the accruing force of beauty, as well as sequence and repetition. I quote, "The soul takes delight in the sound of holy hymns. The more she hears these hymns that are sung for her, the more she becomes pure, modest, and full of hope and discernment." Among the most important liturgical sounds, Jacob stressed, was the singing of the women's choirs, a practice distinctive to late antique Syriac churches and a living tradition to this day. From the 4th century, these choirs were a prominent feature of Syriac daily offices and liturgies in civic churches. From the early 5th century, they were canonically regulated in both Roman and Persian territory. That is, where Greek or Latin liturgies might have occasionally included choirs of nuns for special services, Easter, such as Egeria tells us, or important funerals, bishops. Women's choirs in Syriac, consecrated but not monastic, were an integral part of everyday civic church life. They sang at morning and evening prayers, they sang on Sundays, they sang on festivals. Moreover, the women's choirs had as their designated liturgical role, according to canonical mandate, and this is already there early in the 5th century, to sing the madroshe, the doctrinal hymns of the church. This was a teaching ministry of doctrinal authority, teaching orthodox truth through sacred song. Jacob of Sarug wrote a homily about Ephraim, the Syrian, and in it he discusses the women's choirs at length, For in Syriac tradition, it was Ephraim himself who founded the choirs during the 4th century, specifically to sing his hymns and provide right teaching for the congregations. Ephraim talks about the choirs, he refers to the choirs, he speaks to the choirs in his hymns. He doesn't tell us he founded the choirs, but in later tradition, it's Ephraim who founded them. According to Jacob of Sarug and others in Syriac literature, the challenge for the church in Ephraim's time had been the danger of popular and seductive heretical hymns, especially the hymns of Bardaisan, according to some of them. Ephraim's solution was to combat falsehood with truth, and he chose women's voices to do so. In his homily on Ephraim, Jacob of Sarug drew repeated attention to the sound of women singing as an instrument of instruction. He names the choirs malfonioso, female teachers of sacred doctrine. A malfono is not just a teacher, but a teacher of divine tradition. The choirs are malfonioso, sacred teachers. And they sing the madroshe, he says, with a joyful sound. Indeed, he intoned, St. Ephraim himself had admonished the women's choirs, quote, to make their chants instructive melodies, end quote. Their soft tones were a victorious weapon in the battle against heresy. Behold, Jacob marveled, the gatherings of the glorious churches resound with the melodies of the women's choirs. But Jacob emphasized further the sound of the women's choirs as a mark of salvation, practice. Now we go from practice to theology, right? These choirs, women's choirs, had been controversial in Ephraim's own time. Ephraim tells us in his hymns on Nativity the choirs were slandered. Just as Mary was slandered for her pregnancy, his choirs were slandered for their singing. And apparently they were still controversial in Jacob's time. For as everyone knew, Jacob says, Scripture forbid women to speak in church. He cites 1 Corinthians 14:34. Here, according to Jacob of Sarug, was precisely Ephraim's prophetic brilliance in choosing women to be the voice of truth. The women's choirs signified, I quote, an entirely new world, for yonder in the kingdom of heaven, men and women stand equal. What better way to demonstrate the efficacy of the sacraments, Jacob continued, in one and the same font were men and women baptized. From one and the same bread, from one and the same cup did they receive communion. A single salvation, he says, a single salvation belongs to men and women alike. Should they not then both sing God's praise? It was Eve who had silenced women's voice, but now Mary brought them to voice once again. With this logic, Jacob, imitating Ephraim's voice, urged the women of his congregation, until now your gender was brought low because of Eve. But from now on, it is restored by Mary to sing Alleluia. Uncover your faces to sing praise without shame to Christ, the one who granted you freedom of speech by his birth. Hence Jacob instructed his congregations. Women's choirs were the constant reminder that divine dispensation had come to fulfillment, that salvation was indeed upon them. Time and again in his homilies, Jacob cites the sounds of women's choirs. In his homily on the partaking of the mysteries, that is communion, he urges his congregation, quote, pay heed to the hymns sung by the virgins with glorious voices. The wisdom of the Most High has given them to us. These truthful hymns and these glorious women's voices were God's own gift to the community. In Jacob's verses, both the civic and liturgical domains were locations of orchestrated collective interaction, locations of collective performance. Both involve sustained dialogic exchange, often of crafted vocal genres. You ever seen the acclamations that attended pronouncements of the laws in the Senate? Again, crafted vocal genres of responses. In his stress on volume, Jacob points to the diverse competitions intrinsic to late antique civic life. Faithful believers competed with heretics. Religions competed with one another. Monasteries competed with cities. Households competed with shrines. Truth competed with falsehood. As Jacob had observed about Ephraim, music was a primary tool in these battles. One must do more than sing truth. One must outsing falsehood. For example, Jacob, like other bishops of his time, fulminated against the theater, but his real worry seems to have been the attraction of its music. He fretted to his congregation, I quote, "the responses or the choruses, the chants, which are not true, troublesome and confused sounds, melodies which attract children, ordered and cherished songs, skillful chants, lying canticles. Your ears are captivated by song." The music of the theater told its stories in melodies and verses that lingered in the mind and were hummed by children and adults alike. The dangers of the wrong music were real. To the destructive power of theatrical music and song, Jacob contrasted the enlightening power of liturgical music. But he emphasized more than musical content and more than catchy melodies. I quote, "By the sweet voices of young women who sing your praise, O Lord, you have captured the world so that all of it would be moved to your praise. The world had seemed lost to the music of idolatry through the songs of the virgin daughters of pagans. Now all the nations have gathered and assembled for your song of praise." For Jacob, as he emphasized again and again, and again and again, in the conjoined and loud song of worship, every voice mattered, for every voice had a part. Liturgy in its ordered ranks and sequences, its designated tasks and functions, consisted of nothing more and nothing less than an auditory icon of salvific glory. Here for Jacob was perfect liturgy, its ordered sequences mirroring divine dispensation. I quote, this is the last quote. This is the last one. We're at the very end. "Voices upon voices crowd around Christ from every side. The voices of nations who clap their hands to give praise, and the voices of handmaids grouped in choirs to make a joyful noise. The voice of churches who sing praise with their harps, and the voice of monasteries who make a joyful noise to him with their alleluias. The voice of priests who consecrate him with the gentle waving of their hands, and the voice of saints who bless him in every place. The voice of men who sing praises with their tongues, the voice of women who exalt him with their hymns, the voice of children who repeat before him, the voice of teachers who set their knowledge in array. For praise of the Father, the Son awakens all creation." From such a perspective, we might well consider ancient religion to be encapsulated in the sensory experience of sounding sacred song. Such songs were heard and sung amidst other competing and rival contexts, religious, social, and political. They were sung and heard amidst layered practices such as those described by Sotsoman, amidst incense, lights, processions, offerings, objects, adornments, food and wine. They were sung and heard individually and collectively, in harmony and disharmony, amidst competing religions and rival groupings, in languages familiar and foreign. It is the multiplicity of voices from a plenitude of worlds that we as scholars seek to hear as patristic studies moves forward in the 21st century. And I, for one, look forward to hearing that multiplicity of voices over these next 2 days. Thank you very much.
I don't want to say any more after that. I think that voice was more than enough. Susan, I think like Ephraim's female singers, you were loud, we all heard you, but you were very sweet too. It was, thank you. I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that as I anticipated, your words have really fired our imaginations. You've given us a vision or a sense of patristic worlds, the sensory, the relational, the material, the liturgical, the ritual, but above all, the auditory. And that resonates. We can still hear those female voices, especially, resonating, echoing, I think in a way that can't not inspire our work. It will certainly inspire mine. A keynote lecture for a conference as wide-ranging, or as ambitious really, as patristic studies in the 21st century, it's just an impossible thing. It's a daunting challenge to ask of any scholar or any speaker. But I think, Susan, you've more than risen to that challenge. You've set out for us really a way of examining patristics that can't not inspire our future work as individuals, but I think also the future of the discipline. And for that, we're tremendously grateful. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us.